Let's get the Georgia Tech perspective of it with their play-by-play voice. He is Andy Demetra. So, Andy, you texted me 2 weeks ago from Dublin, getting out of a cab. I need you to tell the story. What Syracuse craziness happened to you when you were across the pond in Ireland?
So I was in a taxi on my way back from a radio interview that I did with a morning show in Dublin, which is a separate conversation for a separate time, but I'll only tell you, Brian, that I have now in my career done radio hits for stations in both Dublin, Ireland, and Dublin, Georgia, for our affiliate down there. But I jump in a cab, and the gentleman on the right side, of course, is asking me, what I'm in town for. He mentioned the college football game, and he mentions that he spent 2 years playing soccer at Syracuse. He transferred in from the University of Buffalo after 1 year there, so a very small world, but we spoke a very common language in that taxi ride in Dublin, Ireland, about the sights and sounds of Central New York.
Of all the taxi cabs in all the world, so you had to get into that one. Go figure. I'm like, what are you telling me right now? It's like, what a crazy thing to happen over there. So take us into that. Obviously, that game, and some crazy stuff's happened with Florida State since here, where they lost to BC on Monday, but I think that game opened a lot of people's eyes to a lot of stuff. What did you take out of seeing, Georgia Tech go over there and handle their business like that against Florida State?
Yeah, Brian, it was a storybook game for Georgia Tech, and the way it ended, and getting their first win over a top 10 opponents, and oddly enough, Florida State in 2015. I think you saw a continuation of what could be a very potent Georgia Tech offense. Maybe it didn't reflect in the total number of points they scored, but it's a Georgia Tech team to return 8 offensive starters and 4 offensive linemen from a team that led the ACC in rushing last year, and they were able to get second-level runs against what was thought to be at the time a very stout Florida State defensive line. I think the blue may be off that rose a little bit because Boston College had similar success, but I still think Georgia Tech is a very good, dynamic rushing team led by Haynes King and Jamal Haynes. The biggest improvement that everybody saw in that game is on the defensive line. Georgia Tech really struggled to stop the run last year. They were 128 in the nation in rushing defense. Carlos Santucci came over, defensive coordinator last year at Duke, where he led the Blue Devils to the top scoring defense in the ACC. They've been able to get contact on backs behind the line of scrimmage, which was not a very common sight for Georgia Tech in its run defense last year. And that's really what it boils down to. Can Georgia Tech be a good defensive team without having to rely too heavily on turnovers? And that masked some of their weaknesses last year. They were a top 10 team in takeaways. I think if you can get a more balanced defense where they can get off the field more traditionally, that bodes well for Georgia Tech and its ceiling this year. We saw some glimpses of that against Florida State. So all in all, despite what happened on Monday night with Florida State and BC, I think it set the groundwork for the kind of team that Georgia Tech believes it can be this year.
Well, what do you make of the league right now? Like, we're only a week in, but it feels like a lot has happened, right? I mean, Florida State's 0-2. Clemson, I get it, was Georgia, but they got absolutely slaughtered after halftime. Virginia Tech loses to Vandy. NC State kind of looked wobbly in their game. You see Georgia Tech with a nice win. BC with a nice win. You're seeing different things. It feels, I don't know about you, this feels as wide open as I can ever recall the ACC looking this early in the year.
Yeah, and I don't want to make any sweeping generalizations after one or in some cases 2 games, but you're right. I think there were maybe higher expectations this early conference season in the ACC, and that hasn't materialized yet. A lot of teams were, I should say a lot of pundits were picking teams like Virginia Tech and North Carolina State, maybe to a lesser degree North Carolina, to be top 25 mainstays. But it's just the nature of it, Brian. Not every team is going to live up to the expectations in the rankings. I'm not going to discount Virginia Tech and the type of team they can be this year, but, not every team is going to be, at the end of the day where everybody expects them to be. There were some surprising results. I'd rather be 2-0 and dealing with whatever corrections need to be made than 0-2 like Florida State. But, I think this does kind of showcase that there really is no sure thing in the ACC this year. Maybe by the end of this month we'll get a clearer picture of it, but at least through Week 0 and Week 1, it is anybody's ball game now in this new look ACC.
Yeah, it kind of showed up right in the AP poll coming out yesterday. Miami, they had the best result. They're up at 12th, but Louisville 22, Georgia Tech 23, NC State 24, Clemson 25, Boston College right on the outside. It was all bunched up. I'm sure all the guys say the right thing, how it doesn't affect them at all. What does it mean, though, for Georgia Tech to have a number next to their name at this point of the season?
Look, Brian, there have been a lot of Week 1 darlings. Let's not forget, Colorado was 2-0 and ranked last year.
Yep.
Now, I think Georgia Tech has a much better offensive line than the Buffaloes had last year. So I think, at least internally, Georgia Tech is keeping a very measured perspective on it. Brent Key said, that's an external distraction. And I actually talked to Malik Rutherford, Tech's wide receiver, today, and he said, look, we expected this to happen. We expected to be 2-0. We expected to be where we are now. So it's nothing that mentally they haven't prepared for. But now it's about playing still to their standard as a program, playing to their identity, and not worrying about the fact that they're ranked for the first time in 9 years has invited a bigger target. Even before the AP poll came out, they knew they would be walking into a buzzsaw atmosphere at the Dome this weekend, and what they expect to be a very physical game against a very motivated Syracuse team. So I don't think this has caused any false or inflated sense of confidence from Georgia Tech, though, for the fans to be ranked now for the first time in 9 years, I think it's a validation of where this program is trending under Brent Key. But now you got to validate the ranking with a win this Saturday.
Andy Demetra with us, the voice of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets. Brent Key's pretty good, huh? Like this guy, he stabilized it 2 years ago. He looks like the right guy in the right place right now.
Yeah, there's no substitute for authenticity. And with Brent having been an all-ACC offensive lineman at Georgia Tech, beginning his career as a GA for George O'Leary, in fact, his first ever game as a graduate assistant. So technically the first ever game he coached was against Syracuse in the kickoff game in 2001 at the Meadowlands. So it's all coming full circle for Brent this weekend. But, Georgia Tech is a unique place, but it's a special place. And I think with Brent, you have somebody who oozes passion for this institute, who speaks with such authenticity and conviction about Georgia Tech being successful here. He knows the type of players he needs to get to tap into the potential of Georgia Tech, because he was part of those teams as a player. He was part of those teams as a graduate assistant. And I think that authenticity and that conviction is really resonating, not just with fans, but with the current players, with their recruiting efforts. And I think you're starting to see that battleship turn and Georgia Tech solidify itself as the type of team Brent knew they could be again when he got hired as the interim and then as a full-time head coach.
I had forgotten about that 0-1 game. That was a loss for Syracuse. Syracuse has never beaten Georgia Tech in a game where fans have gotten to see it. So that's maybe that could change this year. They did beat them back in 2020 in the Dome. So we'll see how that goes. But I look at this team and then I see a guy like Haynes King, and my goodness, like he can throw it. He can run it. How dangerous is this guy at this point in his career, where he's kind of seen it all at this point?
I don't think you will see the so-called splash plays from Haynes King that you may see from someone like a Cam Ward, right? But Haynes King is really the perfect conductor of Buster Faulkner's offense. He's a true dual threat. I think he manipulates the mesh really well on that outside zone run game. He's a long strider, so he's faster getting to the edge than a lot of people would give him credit for. And I think he just runs the offense very smartly, and he knows how to find his playmakers in space. So Haynes King did lead the ACC in touchdown passes last year. I think in an ideal world, they wouldn't like for him to lead the ACC in touchdown passes again, because even Brent admitted at times they were relying too much on Haynes King to go out and make a play, which may also account for the fact he also led the ACC in interceptions.
Yeah.
So part of the priority for Haynes this year is to not make as many high-risk throws and certainly to not be put in the position where he has to make those high-leverage throws. But you're going to see a very smooth dual-threat operator out there from Longview, Texas, and Haynes King.
Yeah, I mean, last year you knew he was going to throw a pick in every game, and then you just kind of worked from there. Like, you'll see if he can get rid of that tendency this year. Easier or harder for you as a play-by-play guy that you got Haynes King and Jamal Haynes? You just start every play by saying Haynes and go from there? How do you work that out?
It's the law office of Haynes and Haynes, basically. Yeah, so I do have to just, take a beat, and when I'm seeing if it's Haynes King with Jamal Haynes, either as a sidecar or as the pistol back, just remember, it's King with Haynes holster behind him, or shotgun, Haynes, a sidecar for King. Yeah, so I try to keep it with last names only, but yes, there is some time where I do have to pause here and spot check myself if I'm calling which Haynes properly. It's like the Georgia Tech version of who's on first.
Yeah, and very often one of them will be running the football. So we know Haynes King can do it. How good is Jamal Haynes? I mean, he's going about 80 yards a game right now. He popped in a big way last year. What kind of year are you expecting from him?
He's diminutive, but he's dangerous. And, yeah, he was all ACC and running back and all-purpose back last year after switching from slot receiver in the offseason. He's just a really low-to-the-ground, slippery back who also runs with a low base and with a lot of thump. I mean, he brings his pads. Someone asked me in the preseason, who's Georgia Tech's power back? And my answer to that was Haynes King, because he's not afraid to get you those tough yards between the tackles. And on top of that, he's a former slot receiver, so he's pretty nifty catching out of the backfield as well. He was one of the revelations of that Georgia Tech offense last year. I think he's a true chess piece in Buster Faulkner's offense, the way they motion him pre-snap. You'll see a lot of pre-snap motion regardless for Georgia Tech, but I think the way that they utilize Jamal Haynes and the way that they maneuver him around, that adds to that element of surprise, and I think he's a very forceful, purposeful, explosive runner that is every bit deserving of some of those numbers he posted last year and again this year.
The voice of the Yellow Jackets, Andy Demetra, is with us. Houston, Georgia Tech, coming up Saturday noon in the Dome. You mentioned, Eddie, you talked to Malik Rutherford earlier today. We've known him as a big play guy, right, too. It looks like he's got that. Has he rounded out the game? What's this guy as a wideout this year? He's going almost 100 yards a pop 2 games in.
Slight of stature, but not slight of stats. Malik Rutherford, 5'9", maybe 170, but he's fearless going over the middle. He's great sticking blocks in the perimeter. I think that's another thing that has been ingrained into the culture of this Georgia Tech offense is their wide receivers really get after it, blocking on the perimeter and holding their block, because you will see some tunnel screens and some pop passes and jet sweeps and so forth, which does test your perimeter blocking. And that's where I think the tight ends and wide receivers for Georgia Tech do a very good job. That's where Malik Rutherford, it's unsung because, yeah, he leads Georgia Tech in receptions and had 131 receiving yards against Georgia State last week, but he's an all-around guy who's not afraid to play physically in addition to running those slants and slip screens and make some of those tough contested catches over the middle.
You know, you mentioned defense a little bit earlier, and we saw it last year. Like in the games where Georgia Tech would struggle last year, it was a very similar script, right? Like couldn't stop the run, couldn't get off the field. What has led to that improvement? We see, Kyle Efford at linebacker's got a ton of tackles. Is it him? Is it the line? What has improved in that group this year?
Well, I think they've really responded to Tyler Santucci's scheme change. Not only did Duke lead the ACC in scoring defense last year, they were top 50 nationally in, I think, 8 different defensive categories. So I think he's found a system that's well-tailored to the personnel. Brian, I think also Georgia Tech has more defensive line depth. They're able to rotate more guys in, stay fresher throughout the game. They only have 1 sack, but they have 15 total TFLs versus Georgia State and Florida State. So that's a really encouraging start. And I think their guys up front are doing a good job to hold the point and allow somebody like a Kyle Efford to clean up. And Kyle Efford, who looks like a throwback linebacker, like straight out of the Don McPherson era with the neck pad and the eye black and just running around cleaning house, he's a very good terminator of plays, as his tackles total shows. So I think it's all worked out well for Georgia Tech so far. They know that LaQuint Allen Jr. is a 100-yard game waiting to happen. They certainly respect Kyle McCord's ability to manipulate that box of a defense. But yeah, I think that's been the key, is just a little extra depth, and maybe they not been the liability that it was for most of last season.
You gave me a little tease there, Andy. Don's on the show tomorrow, so we will talk to Don McPherson this week, and he'll be with us post-game, wrapping things up on Saturday. Well, what are you expecting from this game, Andy? You know, I look at this, and if you tell me, like, right now both teams end up in the 30s and we have this wild game, like, I don't think I'd blink at it. I think it could be leaning that way. What are you expecting to see in the Dome on Saturday?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. Brent has said, be prepared. This is the most physical game you're going to play to this point, which I think Florida State kind of reinforced with the way they performed against Boston College on Labor Day.
Yeah.
But look, this is Georgia Tech's first true road game. And not only that, they're playing with that enlarged target as the number 23 team in the nation. I think, you know, they have to protect the football. They have to steer clear of those self-inflicted penalties. They did have 5 holding calls whistled against them against Georgia State and 8 penalties overall. They need to clean that up because no matter how dynamic an offense or crappy a playbook you have, it's hard to overcome 1st and 20 or 2nd and 20. So those will be things that Georgia Tech will be looking to clean up, and I think Kyle McCord, anybody has to respect the job he did at Ohio State and what he did against Ohio last Saturday. So, yeah, I expect this game to play tight, not unlike how it was deep into the fourth quarter last November here in Atlanta.
I guarantee you the Orange offense will look slightly different than it did in that game last year for sure. Passes, Andy. You'll get to see passes this time, so we'll see how that goes.
Maybe we'll even see incompletions because Villari was 14 of 14, was he not?
Was that? Yeah, that was that game, right? Yeah. Dan Villari. Man, last November was so hard to comprehend, Andy. It's hard to remember all the specifics on some of that stuff. But, yeah, he completed, I think, between that and the game after, like 16 or 17 straight passes. It was just like, what is happening in the world right now?
It was interesting trying to explain to our audience, because that was the week after Pitt game, that a tight end playing quarterback won ACC running back of the week.
Yes. And
Georgia Tech fans are pretty intelligent. Like, you have to have good scores if you want to enroll in Georgia Tech, but I feel like even they had to, like, take a couple of beats to comprehend that.
And yeah, so that was it still is a factually true statement. This year, Dan's rocking like a neck roll for the tight end spot. So he's upped his game in the swag bag. So we'll see how that goes on Saturday. All right, man. Safe travels back up here this week. Thanks for hopping on as always.
My first football game at the Dome since my senior year at Syracuse, going on 20-plus years. I'm sure it's not changed at all, so I look forward to seeing you, Brian.
Oh, yeah, looks exactly the same, Andy. You'll find
that's what I heard.
Yeah, same address anyway. You'll find it. All right, man. Thanks a lot. There he is. Andy Demetra, voice of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets, Syracuse grad himself back in 03. So there we are. Always great to chat with Andy. I think we had a good game this Saturday.